So, what is God's provision? In one word, where is the provision? The provision is in the promises. Say that. The provision is in the promises. Well, I don't need to write it up. If you said, let's say it once more. The provision is in the promises. So it's in the promises of God, as we believe them and obey them, that we find we have total provision for every need. And the result of believing and obeying the promises is staggering. I looked at this very carefully in the Greek text before I came this evening, because I wanted to be sure that I wasn't misrepresenting it. Actually, the English, in a way, almost understates it. That through these being the promises, you may be partakers or share in the divine nature. What does the divine nature mean? It means the nature of God. That's right. So through believing and obeying the promises, we can receive the nature of God within us. And in process, or in proportion as we receive the nature of God, we are delivered from the corruption which is in the world through lust. The nature of God and corruption are incompatible. Where one comes, the other cannot be. You remember probably the story of Jacob when he was fleeing from his brother Esau, and he had nothing in his hand but a staff and nothing to put his head on but a stone, and he was sleeping out in the open. He had a dream. He had a dream of heaven. I remember once hearing a preacher say many years ago, he said, if I could have a dream of heaven, I'd be willing to sleep on a stone. And in this dream, he saw a ladder. The foot was on the earth, the head was in heaven, and the angels of God were descending and ascending. Well, in a sense, the promises of God are like that ladder. Every rung is a promise. And as you put your foot on the promise, you go one step higher. Promise by promise by promise by promise by promise, you are progressively becoming a partaker of the nature of God. If that isn't exciting, I don't know what is. If you don't get excited about your faith from time to time, I don't know how much faith you really have. So, all right, there we are. Now we're going to go to the process. I wonder if my able assistant down there would come and clean off the board for me. Do we have a cloth? No, we don't. Yes, we do. Thank you. Appreciate that. She doesn't like me to tell you, but this is one of my granddaughters. She's got a degree in cleaning blackboards. All right, while she's doing that, we're going on with verse 5. But also for this very reason, because of what has been said, it's all right, she'll do it, don't worry. I see you all looking anxiously at her. All right, we're in verse 5. But thank you very much, appreciate that. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence. And notice the word diligence. Very important word. You'll find it occurs several times in this chapter. What's the opposite of diligence? Slothfulness, or in more contemporary English, laziness. That's right. You search the Bible from cover to cover and see if you can ever find one good word spoken about laziness. Most Christians agree that drunkenness is a sin, but I'll tell you, the Bible is much more severe in its condemnation of laziness than it is of drunkenness. And lots of churches that wouldn't tolerate a drunkard tolerate a lot of lazy people. Is that right? You don't have to answer me. Also, for this very reason, giving all diligence, now we come to a process of adding. This, in a certain sense, you could compare to the ladder. Or you could compare it to a building. And what do you begin with? What is the foundation? Faith. There is no other starting point in your relationship with God. Without faith, it is difficult to please God. Is that right? It is impossible to please God. The one who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Notice that word. So there is no other starting point in this process to perfection but faith. Let's make faith the foundation. I wish I was as clever as some other people at working on a blackboard, but I'm not. But I do my best. All right, that's the foundation block on which everything has to be built. See that? There's no other foundation in the Christian life but faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and his atonement on our behalf. Now we're going to look at the adding process. What's the first thing we add? We're in verse 5. Add to your faith virtue. I think almost all the translations say virtue. Some say moral excellence. Do they say moral excellence? Goodness. I prefer the word excellence. And I like to leave out the moral, because I don't think it's purely religious. See, in the Greek language, the Greek word, which is arete, is very widely used. And for instance, the arete, or the excellence of a horse, is to run fast. So the word means do well whatever you do. So if you call it moral excellence, a lot of lazy people will just say, well, I go to church and say my prayers, and they will not cultivate excellence in their jobs. See, the way you do your job at work tells most people much more about you than what happens in church. Because in church, the only people see you are basically other churchgoers. God imprinted on this on me very early when I was saved in the British Army. I didn't like the British Army, believe me. And I thought, now I'm saved, God will get me out. I mean, I should be doing something more spiritual. Well, he didn't get me out. I spent another 4.5 years in the army. And I came to realize that the validity of my Christian testimony would be judged by how well I served in the army. Now, I was a medical orderly. I was a medical orderly because I volunteered for the medical corps because I didn't want to kill people. I'm not recommending that attitude. That was just me. That was me before I was saved. I was a philosopher, I was a rebel, I was a hippie before my time. You can give me a lot of descriptive words. I understand hippies thoroughly. There just weren't any hippies in my day, otherwise I'd have been one. I did have a blue teddy bear coat. I don't suppose any of you can imagine what a blue teddy bear coat is like, but they were those sort of, about that thick, sort of pseudo fur, and it was a kind of electric blue. That was my way of protesting against society. Anyhow, I ended up as a medical orderly, and I mean, I had a lot of qualifications, but none of them did me any good in the medical corps. RAMC, Royal Army Medical Corps. I can even tell you my number. I will never forget that as long as I live. 7385778. So God really dealt with me. See, the thing was that all the male members of my family I've ever known have been officers in the British Army. So I was totally used to mingling with officers. And now I was not mingling with officers. And I learned something very significant. People look very different from underneath to what they look when you're on their level. And I was shocked when I saw some of the things that I saw in the officers. And I realized they were in me. Anyhow, to round this part of the talk off, when you're discharged from the British Army, they give you an evaluation. And I don't say this to boast, but it's part of my testimony. When I was discharged, my conduct was evaluated with one word, which was exemplary. Now, I never concealed the fact that I was a Christian. I spoke to the commanding officers and others about the Lord. I lived the life for God, but at the end the army had to give me its top grade, see. That's excellence. Not at preaching or interpreting languages, but doing things like emptying bedpans and taking temperatures. Matter of fact, when they discovered that after I was saved I didn't smoke or drink, the obvious place to put me was in the canteen, because I was the only one who could be trusted not to steal. So I spent a lot of my time in the canteen. As a matter of fact, this is by the way, and I probably shouldn't be going into it, but I took part in the longest retreat in the history of the British Army, which was in North Africa from a place called El Agheila to El Alamein. And here I was on this lorry. Theoretically, I was in charge of a squad of 8 stretcher bearers. They were known throughout the unit as Prince's Pioneers. And we carried the canteen on the lorry. I mean, beer, cigarettes, chocolate, all sorts of things. And most of the time we were hungry because we didn't really get our rations as we should have done. Well, we retreated so rapidly that we ran into one of our own minefields. They didn't have time to clear it away. But it was a vehicle minefield, so it was all right. You could walk on foot through it. So we had to evacuate our lorry and walk off on foot. And I wrestled with this thing. Should I leave these cigarettes and chocolates there for, who knows, the Germans or who knows? And I couldn't do that. So I sold out the whole content of the canteen in the middle of the night in the minefield. But I had to sell it on credit because nobody had any money. And I'll tell you, I regretted that many times. I had an awful job getting that money back out of those people. But anyhow, my ultimate, I've got a paybook still to this day to prove it, was exemplary. And I just want to suggest to you that you sometimes may need to examine how you deal in non-religious matters. We purvey my books through bookstores. I have a lot of books and they're sold in bookstores. What we learned was the Jesus bookstore is the most unlikely to pay its bills. You know that? My son-in-law, who's the director of our ministry, was arranging something about cardboard cases for packing. And he said, I've found the firm. But then he looked at me rather apologetically and said, but they're not Christians. I said, thank God. I am sorry to say it, but that's the way it is. See, at another time, I was a trainer of teachers in East Africa. I was principal of a teacher training college for African teachers. My real aim, I was there to win them to the Lord. And I thank God that most years, every student that graduated had been saved and baptized in the Spirit. And I would have to say, this is really relevant, we established a record in the whole educational system of Kenya. Because one year we had every student who passed in every subject. And I still have a letter somewhere from the representative of the education department thanking me for this unique achievement. And we were Pentecostal. Nobody believed that Pentecostals could do things like that. They expected us to be the bottom. You know what I'm talking about? And that's a reproach to the Lord. So let's put up number 1. This is the first building block on the foundation. Excellence. Think about that for a moment. What are you? Are you a teacher? Then you ought to be an excellent teacher. My students would accept the Lord and get saved, and their attitude was, well, no, you won't expect so much of us because we're Christians. And I used to say to them, you're totally wrong. I expect a whole lot more of you. If you could be a teacher without being a Christian, you ought to be a much better teacher when you can pray and seek God's help and wisdom. So what are you? Are you a nurse? You ought to be an excellent nurse. Are you a bus driver? You ought to be an excellent bus driver. Are you a shop assistant? You ought to be an excellent shop assistant. That's the first step in your upward process. I think it's dropped out of a lot of people's thinking. Let's read what he says again. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith excellence. Now, without faith, you wouldn't be able to achieve excellence in many cases. But faith opens the way for excellence. There's a statement in the Epistle of James that appeals to me. James chapter 2 and verse 18. And James is pointing out to believers in Jesus that it's not much use just saying you're a believer. You have to demonstrate it by the way you live. And so he says, someone will say to you, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. In other words, I'll show you what I believe by what I do. Is that fair? Ought we not to be able to say that? I'll show you what I believe by the way I live. Watch my life, and you'll see what faith can do. Is that fair?